There's a stench that clings to the end of power, a uniquely foul perfume of decay. It is the smell of fear, of course, but is also something more visceral. In the final, agonizing months of his life, Tsar Ivan IV of all Russia was the living embodiment of this putrescence. His body, once lean and imposing, had become a grotesque parody of royalty, a swollen, weeping vessel of sickness. His limbs were bloated with effusions, his skin was a roadmap of sores and peeling flesh, and a constant, low-grade agony radiated from his bones. His physicians, practitioners of a crude and often fatal art, had for years plied him with mercury-based unguents to combat the ravages of what was likely advanced syphilis, and the cure had become its own poison. The heavy metals seeped into his system, rotting him from the inside out, inflaming his already volcanic temper and warping his thoughts into ever more bizarre and terrifying shapes. The air in his private chambers within a Moscow Kremlin was thick and heavy, a miasma of medicinal herbs, sweat, unwashed linens, and the unmistakable, sickly sweet odor of dying tissue. It was the smell of a man whose soul had putrefied long before his body began its final, gruesome surrender. How does a man become a monster? How does a ruler, celebrated in his youth as a brilliant reformer and a pious defender of the faith, transform into a figure of such legendary and sadistic cruelty that his name becomes a synonym for terror itself? The story of Ivan the Terrible is not merely a chronicle of political ambition or military conquest. It is a descent into a personal hell, a chilling case study in which the profound traumas of a broken childhood were fused with the absolute, corrupting force of unlimited power. To understand the Tsar of Terror, one must look past the simplistic caricature of a mad king and instead trace the deep, bleeding wounds inflicted upon a young boy who learned early and brutally that the world was a pit of vipers, and the only way to survive was to become the most venomous serpent of all. This is the story of how a man's inner demons were unleashed upon an entire nation, and how the grief and paranoia of a single, shattered mind plunged a kingdom into an abyss of blood and fear. It is a testament to the terrifying reality that the state can become the instrument of one man's private agony, and that the crown, meant to be a symbol of divine order, can become a crucible for unimaginable horror. The crucible for Ivan's soul was forged in the cold, treacherous corridors of the Kremlin during the 1530s and 1540s. He was born in 1530 to the Grand Prince of Moscow, Vasily III, an imposing figure who had done much to consolidate the Russian lands. But this world of security shattered when Ivan was just 3 years old. Vasily died, leaving his young son as the nominal ruler and his wife, Elena Galinskaya, as regent. Elena was intelligent and capable, but she was a woman in a world of rapacious, power-hungry men, and she was an outsider, of Lithuanian and Mongol lineage. She ruled with a firm hand for 5 years, but her regency was a constant battle against the ancient, landed aristocracy, the boyars. Then, when Ivan was 8, Elena died suddenly, almost certainly from poison, a favorite tool of Russian court politics. With her death, the final barrier between the orphan Grand Prince and the circling wolves was removed. What followed was a decade of abject terror and humiliation that would permanently scar the boy's psyche. The great boyar clans, chiefly the Shuiskis and the Belskis, seized control of the state, fighting viciously amongst themselves for supremacy. The young Ivan and his deaf-mute brother, Yuri, were nothing more than inconvenient symbols, pawns in their savage game. They were neglected, isolated, and often left hungry and dressed in rags. They lived in a state of constant fear, watching as the boyars plundered the treasury, barged into their private chambers, and treated them with open contempt. Ivan would later write of this time with burning hatred, recalling how the Shuiski princes would put their feet up on his late father's bed, behaving as if they were the masters. He witnessed murder, casual brutality, and betrayals firsthand. He saw allies of his mother dragged away and killed, their blood staining the palace floors. In this brutal education, He learned his first lessons of power, that it was absolute, that it was maintained through violence, and that mercy was a weakness to be exploited. He learned to dissemble, to hide his true thoughts behind a mask of piety and meekness. While he was outwardly a neglected orphan, inwardly he was nursing a prodigious intellect and an even more prodigious capacity for hatred. He devoured books, particularly religious texts and histories of the Roman and Byzantine empires, seeing in their absolute rulers a model for the power he one day intended to wield. The seeds of both his visionary state-building and his monstrous tyranny were sown in these same bitter years of childhood terror. To comprehend the stage upon which Ivan's drama would unfold, one must understand the unique world of 16th-century Muscovy. It was a realm caught between worlds, looking eastward to the legacy of the Mongol Golden Horde and westward to the Catholic powers of Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden. The very concept of the Tsar was new and potent. Ivan was the first ruler to be formally crowned with this title, a Slavic derivation of Caesar, in a lavish Byzantine-style ceremony in 1547. This was no mere change in nomenclature. It was a profound ideological statement. The Tsar was not just a grand prince. He was God's anointed regent on earth, the temporal head of the Orthodox faith, tasked with protecting his holy kingdom from all enemies, both external and internal. This belief in his divine mission would become a central pillar of Ivan's identity, providing a righteous justification for even his most horrific acts. He was the shepherd of his people, and if the flock was riddled with diseased sheep, the treacherous boyars, then it was his holy duty to cull them without mercy. This fusion of absolute political power and divine mandate created a ruler who believed he was accountable to God alone, a terrifying prospect in a man already predisposed to suspicion and violence. The early years of Ivan's majority, however, gave little hint of the horrors to come. In the same year as his coronation, he married Anastasia Romanovna, a woman from a minor boyar family. The marriage, however, proved to be a genuine and deep love match. Anastasia was by all accounts a gentle, pious, and intelligent woman who exerted a powerful calming and moderating influence on her volatile husband. For 13 years, with Anastasia by his side, Ivan ruled as a competent and even visionary monarch. This period was marked by significant and positive reforms. He convened the Zemsky Sobor, a form of national assembly, to give a wider base of support to his rule. He commissioned a new, comprehensive legal code, the Sudebnik of 1550, which standardized justice and administration across his realm. He created the Streltsy, Russia's first standing army of professional musketeers, reducing his reliance on the fickle boyar levies. Most spectacularly, he turned his attention to the centuries-old threat from the Tatar Khanates to the south and east. In 1552, in a brilliant and brutal campaign, he conquered the Khanate of Kazan, a victory that resonated with immense religious and symbolic power. It was seen as a final triumph of the Orthodox cross over the Islamic crescent, avenging centuries of Russian subjugation under the Tatar yoke. For years later, he took the Khanate of Astrakhan, securing the entire length of the Volga River for Russia. In these years, Ivan was hailed as a hero, a state builder, a new David or Constantine. He was energetic, intelligent, and fiercely dedicated to the project of forging a strong, centralized, and holy Russian state. It seemed as if the demons of his childhood had been tamed, held at bay by his love for Anastasia and his dedication to his divine mission. But they were not gone. They were merely sleeping. The first tremor that threatened to awaken the slumbering demons came in 1553. Ivan fell gravely, almost fatally ill. Believing himself to be on his deathbed, he gathered the leading boyars and demanded they swear an oath of allegiance to his infant son, the Tsarevich Dmitri. To his shock and mounting fury, they hesitated. Led by his own cousin, Vladimir of Staritsa, many boyars were deeply reluctant to pledge their loyalty to a baby, which would mean another long regency, likely under the despised Romanov clan of his wife. They saw an opportunity to install a more pliable adult ruler. Lying helpless, burning with fever, Ivan saw their hesitation not as political pragmatism, but as naked, venomous treason. He watched the men who were supposed to be his most loyal servants plot to betray his own flesh and blood. Though he eventually recovered from the illness, he never recovered from the paranoia it had kindled. The incident confirmed every dark suspicion he had harbored since his childhood, that he was surrounded by traitors, that their smiles hid daggers, and that they would destroy him and his family the moment they perceived him to be weak. He had seen their true faces, and he would never forget them. The true, cataclysmic breaking point, the event that shattered the fragile dam holding back the flood of his madness, came in the summer of 1560. His beloved wife, his anchor and his solace, Tsaritsa Anastasia, fell ill and died after a lingering sickness. For Ivan, this was no natural death. His grief was immediate, volcanic, and all-consuming, but it quickly curdled into a white-hot certainty. She had been murdered. He was utterly convinced that the boyars, whom he believed had hated her and her family's influence, had slowly poisoned her. Modern forensic analysis of Anastasia's remains has, in fact, revealed unusually high levels of mercury, lending some credence to Ivan's paranoid accusations. But whether she was truly poisoned or died from a natural illness treated with toxic mercury-based medicines is almost irrelevant. In Ivan's mind, the verdict was already delivered. The traitors had finally struck at the one thing he held most dear. They had taken his light, his love, his hope. With Anastasia's death, the good period of Ivan's reign came to a screeching, violent end. The moderating influence was gone. The grief-stricken, paranoid Tsar now stood alone, and he was determined to make his enemies, and all of Russia, suffer for his loss. The darkness that had been gathering for 30 years was about to be unleashed with the force of a hurricane. The initial consequences of Anastasia's death were swift and brutal. The court, once a center of reform and measured policy, became a place of dread. Ivan's grief manifested as a terrifying, unpredictable rage. He lashed out, ordering the arrest, torture, and execution of several prominent boyars he held responsible for his wife's death, often on the flimsiest of pretexts. His two most trusted advisors from his early reign, Adashev and Sylvester, who had counseled moderation, were disgraced and exiled, seen now as part of the conspiracy against him. His behavior grew more and more erratic. He indulged in drunken debauches that alternated with fits of extreme, performative piety. The fear in the Kremlin was palpable. No one knew who would be next to fall victim to the Tsar's spiraling paranoia. This period of chaotic, personalized revenge, however, was merely a prelude. Ivan was conceiving of a new, more systematic way to wage war on his internal enemies. He was preparing to carve up his own country and create an instrument of terror so absolute that would burn his name into the annals of history forever. In the winter of 1564, Ivan made his most dramatic and terrifying move yet. In a calculated piece of political theater, he abruptly abdicated the throne. He packed up his treasures, his icons, and his family, and left Moscow for the fortified settlement of Alexandrov Sloboda, 100 kilometers to the northeast. From there, he sent 2 letters back to the capital. The first, addressed to the Metropolitan, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, was a blistering tirade against the boyars, the clergy, and the officials, accusing them of treason, corruption, and embezzlement. He declared that, in his great anger, he was abandoning his kingdom. The second letter, addressed to the common people of Moscow, was a masterpiece of manipulation. He assured the merchants and ordinary citizens that he had no anger towards them. His wrath was reserved for the treacherous elites. The effect was exactly as he had intended. Thrown into a state of panic and chaos, with the specter of boyar misrule looming once again, a great procession of clergy and commoners made their way through the snow to Alexandrov Sloboda and tearfully begged their Tsar to return. Ivan, the master manipulator, made them wait. When he finally agreed, it was on his own terrifying terms. He would return, but only if he were granted the authority to create his own private domain within the state, an entity accountable to no one but himself, where he could punish traitors with absolute, unquestioned power. This new domain was to be called the Oprichnina, from the Old Russian word oprich, meaning apart or separate. The boyars and the church, trapped by his political genius, had no choice but to agree. Russia was about to be vivisected. The Oprichnina was one of the strangest and most sinister political creations in history. Ivan divided the entire territory of Muscovy in two. The Zemshchina, or the land, would continue to be administered by the traditional boyar council. But the Oprichnina was the Tsar's personal fiefdom, comprising some of the richest and most important lands and districts, including parts of Moscow itself. To enforce his will within this new territory, Ivan created a personal bodyguard and death squad of 1,000, later expanding to 6,000, men known as the Oprichniki. They were a terrifying sight, a veritable brotherhood of demons. Clad entirely in black, like monks, they rode black horses and bore a horrifying insignia on their saddles, a severed dog's head and a broom. The symbolism was stark and brutal. They were to sniff out treason like dogs and sweep it from the land of Russia. The Oprichniki were chosen not for their noble birth, but for their loyalty to Ivan and their ruthlessness. They swore a personal oath to the Tsar, severing all ties with their families and the Zemshchina. They were, in effect, a state-sponsored terrorist organization, given carte blanche to expropriate land, persecute, torture, and execute anyone Ivan deemed an enemy, with complete impunity. What followed was a 7-year reign of terror that defies easy comprehension. The Oprichnina became a shadow state, and its capital at Alexandrov-Sloboda a bizarre parody of a monastery that was, in reality, a den of torture, prayer, and debauchery. Ivan, who now styled himself the abbot, would lead his black-clad Oprichniki, whom he called his brethren, in marathon church services, prostrating himself with such fervor that his forehead was permanently bruised. These frenzied displays of piety would then give way to wild, drunken orgies and, most horrifically, to the methodical and sadistic torture of political prisoners in the dungeons below. Ivan often presided over these sessions personally, devising excruciating torments with a chilling creativity. The terror was not random. It was a systematic campaign to shatter the power and independence of the old boyar aristocracy. Entire clans were wiped out, their lands and fortunes absorbed into the Oprichnina. The atmosphere across Muscovy was one of pervasive, suffocating fear. A knock on the door in the middle of the night could mean dispossession, torture, and a brutal death. Prominent figures, like Prince Andrei Kurbsky, a former close friend and brilliant general, fled to Lithuania, from where he and Ivan exchanged a series of extraordinary letters. Kurbsky accused Ivan of succumbing to flatterers and tyrants, while Ivan's replies were a thundering, paranoid, and self-pitying defense of his absolute power, portraying himself as the righteous, suffering servant of God, betrayed by all. The psychological state of the Tsar during this period was a terrifying vortex of contradictions. He was the devout abbot and the depraved sadist, the weeping penitent and the remorseless executioner. He seemed to genuinely believe in his divine mission to purge Russia of its sins, viewing himself as God's wrathful instrument. The terror reached its apogee in 1570 with the infamous sack of Novgorod. Ivan had become convinced that the ancient and proud city, a historic rival to Moscow's power, was plotting to defect to Lithuania. Leading his army of Oprichniki, he descended upon the city like the wrath of God. For 5 weeks, Novgorod was subjected to an orgy of systematic slaughter. Thousands of men, women, and children were rounded up each day. They were tortured with fire and ropes, then tied to sleighs and driven into the icy Fokhov River to drown. Chroniclers report that the river was so choked with corpses that it overflowed its banks. Monasteries were plundered, churches desecrated. The city was utterly broken, its spirit and independence extinguished in a tide of blood. By the time Ivan and his black-clad riders left, tens of thousands lay dead. It was an act of such monumental, calculated cruelty that it shocked even a brutal age. It was the act of a man who saw treason everywhere, and whose solution was not justice, but annihilation. Ivan's private war against the demons of his past had become a public holocaust. The ultimate and most tragic culmination of Ivan's rage, paranoia, and ungovernable temper occurred not on a battlefield or in a torture chamber, but within the private chambers of his own palace. The climax of his personal crisis was an act so profoundly self-destructive it seemed to defy all rationality. In November 1581, Ivan murdered his own son and heir, the Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich. The young Ivan was 27 years old, intelligent, competent, and by all accounts as hot-tempered as his father. He was the product of the beloved union with Anastasia and the only hope for the continuation of the dynasty in a capable line. The exact cause of the fatal argument is lost to history, mired in conflicting accounts. One story claims Ivan burst in on his son's pregnant wife, Yelena, and berated her for being immodestly dressed, striking her and causing a miscarriage. When the Tsarevich rushed to his wife's defense, the argument escalated. Another version suggests the son confronted his father, demanding to be given command of an army to fight the Poles and Lithuanians in the ongoing Livonian War. Whatever the spark, the powder keg of the Tsar's fury, primed by decades of stress, grief, and mercury poisoning, finally exploded. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, the Tsar raised his heavy, iron-tipped staff, a constant companion he used for support and, frequently, to strike down courtiers who displeased him, and brought it down upon his son's head. The blow landed on the Tsarevich's temple, a sickening crack of iron against bone. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. The Tsar's volcanic rage evaporated in a flash, replaced by a wave of utter, soul-crushing horror. As his son collapsed, blood pouring from the gash in his skull, Ivan fell to his knees beside him. He cradled the young man's head in his lap, frantically trying to staunch the bleeding with his own hands, kissing his son's face and wailing his name. The iconic, haunting painting by Ilya Repin captures this moment of terrible lucidity. The father's eyes wide with a madness born not of rage, but of instant, unbearable grief and regret. In that single, convulsive act of violence, Ivan had done what no boyar conspiracy or foreign enemy could ever have accomplished. He had destroyed his own future. He had murdered his dynasty. The court was paralyzed with terror and shock. The Tsarevich lingered for several days, his father never leaving his side, praying ceaselessly to God for a miracle that would not come. When young Ivan finally died, the Tsar's grief was that of a damned soul. The man who had presided over the slaughter of thousands without flinching was now utterly broken by a single death, a death caused by his own hand. This act shattered the last vestiges of his sanity and his will to rule. He had become his own worst enemy, the ultimate traitor to his own sacred mission. The iron-willed autocrat who had been a nation to his will was now just a desolate old man, howling in the empty corridors of the Kremlin, his life's work turned to ash by one terrible, irreversible moment of fury. The climax of his reign was not a great victory or a political masterstroke, but a sordid, pathetic, and profoundly tragic act of filicide. In the immediate aftermath of his son's death, Ivan plunged into a chasm of inconsolable grief from which he would never emerge. The fearsome Tsar, the Grozny, became a spectral figure, wandering the palace at night, crying out for his murdered heir. He would send vast sums of money to monasteries all across Russia, along with long lists of his victims, including his son, requesting that the monks pray for the salvation of their souls, and for his. His health, which had been deteriorating for years, now completely collapsed. The iron will that had driven him was gone, replaced by a leaden despair. The Oprichnina, as a formal institution, had already been disbanded in 1572. Its spectacular failure to defend Moscow from a devastating raid by the Crimean Tatars in 1571 had exposed its military uselessness against external foes. Ivan, in a characteristic fit of pique, had turned on his own creation, executing many of its leaders. But the spirit of the Oprichnina, the legacy of absolute power, terror, and suspicion, had already been permanently woven into the fabric of the Russian state. Now, the architect of that terror was a broken, shuffling wreck, tormented by the ghost of the son he had killed. His final years, from 1581 to 1584, were a grim chronicle of physical and mental decay. He became even more corpulent and swollen, his body a festering prison of pain. The mercury that was supposed to have cured him continued its slow, inexorable work of destroying him. His mind, always a labyrinth of paranoia, now sought refuge in the arcane. He turned away from the orthodox clergy he had long dominated and placed his trust in sorcerers and astrologers summoned from as far away as Lapland. He became obsessed with knowing the day of his death, desperate to bargain with fate. The soothsayers, perhaps bravely or foolishly, told him the truth he demanded. They predicted he would die on the 18th of March, 1584. As the day approached, the Tsar became increasingly agitated, a cornered beast awaiting the inevitable. On the morning of the 18th, he felt surprisingly well. He mocked the fortune-tellers, declared they should be put to death for their false prophecy, and called for a hot bath to soothe his aching limbs. The final scene of his life played out with a strange, mundane placidity that belied the stern, undy drang of his reign. After his bath, feeling refreshed, Ivan sat down in his chambers to play a game of chess with the nobleman Boris Godunov, a shrewd and ambitious figure who had risen to prominence in the court. As he arranged the pieces on the board, he suddenly slumped backward, overturning the chessboard, and fell silent. The reign of terror was over. The official cause of death was given as a stroke, a plausible end for a man in such poor health. Yet, as with so many deaths in his violent orbit, rumors immediately began to swirl. Had he been poisoned? Had Boris Godunov, the man who stood to gain the most from the Tsar's demise, hastened the inevitable? The suspicions were never proven, but they lingered, a fittingly murky postscript to a life shrouded in conspiracy and bloodshed. The great and terrible Tsar was dead, leaving behind a kingdom traumatized and a dynasty on the precipice of extinction. The long-term consequences of Ivan's reign were catastrophic. His only surviving son from his marriage to Anastasia was Fifer, a man known for his gentle spirit and profound piety, but who was also feeble-minded and utterly incapable of ruling. Power effectively passed to a council of regents, dominated by the brilliant and ruthless Boris Godunov. The final, tragic act of the Rurik dynasty played out a few years later when Ivan's youngest son, Dmitri, from a later marriage, died under mysterious circumstances in the town of Uglich, his throat cut, allegedly during an epileptic seizure. With Fifer's death in 1598 without an heir, the 700-year-old dynasty of Rurik, which had founded the Russian state, came to an end. Russia was plunged into a devastating 15-year period of anarchy, civil war, foreign invasion, and famine known as the Time of Troubles. It was the direct, bitter harvest of Ivan's destructive legacy. History's judgment of Ivan the Terrible remains deeply contested, a battleground of competing interpretations. Was he simply a bloodthirsty madman, a paranoid psychopath who happened to wear a crown? Or was he, as some historians have argued, a calculating and rational state builder who used terror as a necessary, if brutal, tool to achieve a modernizing political goal, the destruction of the feudal, decentralized power of the boyars and the forging of a powerful, centralized autocracy? This latter view found favor even with Joseph Stalin, who saw in Ivan a predecessor, a strong leader who understood the necessity of ruthlessness in the service of the state. These two views, the madman versus the master politician, are not necessarily mutually exclusive. It is perhaps most accurate to see Ivan as a man in whom both resided, a brilliant political mind tragically fused to a deeply damaged and paranoid psyche. The ultimate moral of Ivan's story lies in this terrifying synthesis. It is a profound and enduring cautionary tale about the confluence of personal trauma and unchecked, absolute power. His reign demonstrates how the private demons of a single individual, when given the vast apparatus of the state as their playground, can inflict wounds upon the body politic that fester for generations. The cruelty he suffered as a child became the cruelty he inflicted upon his kingdom. His fear of betrayal became a self-fulfilling prophecy, as his terror drove his subjects to conspire against him. He saw himself as the divine surgeon cutting the cancer of treason from his holy Russia, but he was, in fact, the cancer itself, a malignancy that metastasized from the throne and consumed the nation. The contrast between the public image and the private reality is stark and haunting. There is the official Ivan, the crowned czar, God's regent, the conqueror of Kazan, the lawgiver, the figure depicted in pious icons. And then there is the true Ivan, the neglected, terrified boy, the grief-maddened husband, the howling, penitent abbot of a torture monastery, the broken old man weeping over the son he had just murdered. His grand project to build a powerful Russian state was inseparable from his personal vendetta against the ghosts of his past. The state he built was indeed strong, but it was a strength founded on fear, cemented with blood, and haunted by the memory of his monstrous deeds. In the end, we return to the image of his final days, to the swollen, stinking wreck of a man waiting for death in his Kremlin chambers. That physical decay was merely the outward sign of a much deeper rot. It was the physical manifestation of a soul that had been eaten away by grief, by rage, by paranoia, and by the terrible, absolute certainty of its own divine righteousness. Ivan the Terrible did not just rule Russia. He remade it in his own tormented image, leaving behind not a stable empire, but a traumatized nation and a legacy of terror so profound that his name, Grozny, meaning fearsome or awe-inspiring, would forever be synonymous with the darkest capabilities of the human heart when armed with absolute power.